As our guests join us, why don't I start with our brief introductions and start with the main event. As I mentioned, this is the Science of Philanthropy Initiative virtual webinar, and we are fortunate today to have a talk on adding voltage to your philanthropy. And we have a special treat today to have with us as our speaker, John List, who is the founder, along with his colleagues at the University of Chicago, of the Science of Philanthropy Initiative. The Science of Philanthropy Initiative seeks to apply field experiments and the experimental method more broadly in order to improve philanthropy. I regret that we're not actually located right now with John in Indianapolis, but we were canceled not because of the pandemic, but because of snow. But we do look forward to welcoming all of you and John to Indianapolis, September 21 and 22, when we will have the next Science of Philanthropy conference. I am eager to hear John speak about his new book, The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale. The problem of scale, as we were talking before we began, is central to philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, as it is to other arenas that I think we're going to hear about. But there are very few pathways or obvious pathways to scale in philanthropy. John probably needs very little introduction to this audience. But just to remind you, he is the Kenneth C. Griffin Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. His path-breaking work has been recognized by peers and scholars, including the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has received many prizes and awards that reflect his important contributions to the field of economics. He is also currently the Robert F. Hartsook Chair in Fundraising at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. He has also been active in the world of policy and practice across a wide range of domains, applying science to practice, which I anticipate will be reflected in the voltage effect as well. And it is one of the goals of SPI to connect research and practice. Indeed, our audience happily includes both scholars and practitioners of philanthropy. John's research includes over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles and several published books, including the 2013 international bestseller, The Y-Axis, which he wrote with Ulrich Miesi. And hopefully the voltage effect will also reach a similarly wide audience. So please join me in a warm virtual welcome to my friend, John List. John, take it away.
Amir, thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's always wonderful to be here. Of course, I'd love to be on site. And I really cherish our partnership in adding science to philanthropy. So today I'm going to talk about my book, and I'm going to do something that's very different. I've been giving a lot of book talks since the book came out on Tuesday, and I pretty much walked through the book. But today, since we're about philanthropy, I want to think about what are the implications that the book holds for people who are both trying to raise money and raise awareness of their service or product, but also in helping us to determine what are the best products or services to try to scale, and how then can we map those back into our donor ask and the science of asking people. Okay, so I'm going to call this the demand side and the supply side. And I'm going to argue that we should be adding high voltage or voltage effect thinking into both the demand and supply side. Now, in giving these book talks, everyone always tells me that, for better or worse, the favorite part of the talk is when I do a little experiment at the beginning of it. So that's how I'm going to start this lecture. It'll be a 3 or 4 minute experiment, and I'm going to put up some slides. And I'm going to do a slideshow. And Amir, can you give me the thumbs up? Are we good here? All right. Okay. So in a moment, I will be giving you a QR code, which you will be able to very quickly get a very brief survey. And on that survey, you will be, first of all, asked, can you guess an integer between 1 and 100 inclusive that is this group's average guess? So we're going to look at all of the numbers from this group, and the winner of this competition or contest will be the person who is the closest to 2/3 of this group's average guess. So you are now in an experiment. This probably isn't the first time you've been in one of my experiments. We'll talk about that through the through the lecture today, but what I've learned is when all of you are in an experiment, you want an incentive. Here's the first incentive. I will send the winner a signed copy of the voltage effect, and I will inscribe it however you want me to inscribe it. It can't be something that will get me fired from my heartsick chair, but let's keep the political stuff on the sidelines. It will be something like, you're the best game theorist since John Nash, for example. Okay. Now, as a teacher, I've also learned that people like extra credit. So here's the extra credit question. On that same form, which you'll get in the next slide, I want you to guess what is the equilibrium to this game. Now, equilibrium is economies for saying once everyone guesses that number, no one has an incentive to change. That's an equilibrium in economics, okay? So here's what I want you to do. Get out the old trusty handheld and do that QR code, and voila, you will be directed to a form, and it will say beauty contest at the top. And I will ask you for your email. I promise I will not sell any emails or give any emails away. This is strictly to ask you later when you're a winner what you want for your inscription. Okay? And then you have the two chores there. You have your guess, and then you have what you think the equilibrium is. At the end of my talk, I will announce the winners of this contest. Now, if multiple people win, I will choose one of you randomly. So I'll give away a total of 2 books, because in the end, I still need to hopefully sell some books rather than give them all away. Okay? So I'll give you just a moment to finish that form, and then we'll get moving. Amir, do you have your guesses in already? Do you have the equilibrium, you think? Maybe, maybe. Okay, very good. Very good. So I'm going to go ahead. I think most of you are probably done. And in the background, if you can hear some bone chewing, I have my 2 dogs today because my wife is doing surgery. So I have 2 dogs. I gave them both bones so they don't bother me, but you might hear a little bone chewing in the background. Okay, so let's talk about how to add high voltage to your philanthropy. Now, where I'm going to begin today is I want to talk a little bit about the science of philanthropy. And this is more or less along the lines of what have we learned about who gives and why? And then I'm going to go to a question that I'm oftentimes confronted with in the field, and I call it horizontally scaling. That may have worked in your research study, John, but there's no way it's going to work in my organization. So I think about that as scaling results from one particular research design or research study to other organizations. Now, then I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about what I'm going to term the supply side of fundraising. And this is about the products or services that we provide. What are the features of those programs that we're providing? And how can scaling help us not only in designing those programs, but also coming back to the donor with a program that can truly scale? And I'll talk a little bit about some recent evidence that we've just been developing over the last few weeks that it has not even been public yet, given publicly yet. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts, and I'll come back to the voltage effect experiment as well. And I'll talk a little bit about how that experiment fits in. Okay, so in our own work, we've started off by thinking about the charitable sector as a market. On the one hand, you have the government who makes tax rules. It talks about regulations on charities. So the government affects both people and the charities themselves. But there's this relationship on the bottom here between people and charities which since the late 90s, we've been trying to add science to this particular area and thinking about how do we expand the charitable pie? What are the motivations that people have to give? When I first started doing research in this area, it was primarily art. And it was wonderful art, but there was not as much science, in particular economic science, to try to understand this relationship between people and charities. And that's why when we started, Anya Samak and I started SPI, which is a Science of Philanthropy initiative, that's really what it was about. We're trying to add science to this area right here, which I'm going to call the demand side of fundraising. Okay, so my research agenda, as I mentioned, was really started when the dean at the University of Central Florida, I was a professor down there, that's where I started my career. He knocked on my door and said, John, I want you to start a center for environmental policy analysis. And to start that center, I want you to help raise money. I want you to be in charge of fundraising. So I started to look into the literature, and I came back to him with a few requests. One is, I want to run this ask as an experiment. I want to do a field experiment to learn about the underpinnings of charity. But also, what I've learned is that the experts tell me, before you start a capital project, what you need is upfront money. And what they all told me was secure a fraction of that upfront money before you go public. And of course, back then I said, well, what should that fraction be? Why do you need the fraction? And I heard answers like, well, 33%, and then 50%. And then, well, we do it because my boss did it before and it worked for them. So that's really an invitation to go ahead and do science in this area. And that's what David Lucking Riley and I did in the late 90s when we were exploring the effectiveness of seed money. And what we found in that early paper is that having seed money matters a lot. It not only brings in more donors, but those donors who were going to give anyway actually give more. So then that got us thinking about, well, is there a better usage of those seed monies than simply announcing Bill Gates just gave us $1 million, now we would like you to give as well? That's called an unconditional way to use the seed money. Maybe there's a better conditional way to use it. So then we started talking about match rates and using seed money as a match. And here, the Fundraising Bible back then told us that obviously a 1-to-1 match is more appealing than a 1-to-2 challenge, but a richer challenge greatly adds to the match's attractiveness. Now, if you go back to that early work and say, where does the intuition for that statement come from? Where's the evidence from that statement? Essentially, that statement comes from the law of demand. That basically says 2-for-1 deals are good. If you give people a better deal, they're going to buy more. Now, my question back then was, when people give to a charity, are they purchasing Snickers bars? If they are, that's great. That kind of intuition will work. But if buying a bottle of water or a Snickers bar or a cup of coffee is not the same as giving to a charitable cause, those insights might be wrong. So what did we do? And this is a paper that some of you might know. Dean Carlin and I wrote this paper whereby we had a bunch of households and we did a mailer. And we simply randomized or put these 50,000 households in one of 4 groups. The letters that they received were identical, except if you were in group 1, you were told, we have some upfront money and we can match 1-to-1. If you're in group 2, it's 2-to-1, group 3, 3-to-1, group 4 received no match at all. Okay, so that was a very simple experiment to try to add science to matching. Here's what we found. When you look at the control group, which had no matching, versus all of the other groups combined, so if you do like a per household comparison, what you find is that you raise a lot more money when there's a match. In fact, you raise close to 20% more. Now, where does the effect come from? That effect happens entirely because more people give. That's what an economist calls the extensive margin. You're building a broader base on your pyramid, what we call in the literature the donor pyramid. Okay, so that's sort of nice because all of these fresh funds are from new donors rather than existing donors giving a little bit more. So then what we did is we dug into, well, what about 1-to-1, 2-to-1, or 3-to-1? Now, what we find there is something that was very surprising to us. That statement from the fundraising Bible was not correct. What's important is that you have a match, but what's less important, at least over 1-to-1, 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, is that the rate is unimportant. Now, this gives us kind of two insights. One, if you have upfront money, you are wasting a lot of it using 3-to-1 versus 1-to-1. But two, this is sort of a deep behavioral result that in a lot of cases, having something available, think about your retirement fund. If you have a match available, that's much more important than the size of the match. So this same result that we found here, you also find when people decide how much money to put in their retirement accounts, for example. Having a match matters, but the rate matters much less. You find that in a lot of areas where the mere number, just having a non-zero number is important, but the level of the non-zero number matters much less than just having one. Okay, so now a bunch of you on this call have been part of this literature. So let me be very clear. This literature is very big and growing fast, and there has been a lot of science, and many people on this call have made great impacts. I'm just one of many people doing research in this area. But really, when you look at it, what you find is that upfront money is really important. Whether you have it or don't have it can make or break your campaign. Now, what to do with that upfront money is sort of insightful as well. So when the quality of what you're providing is uncertain, say it's a new program that nobody knows the quality of, or it's a new service or you're a new charity, unconditional seeds are really important. And if they're from somebody who's respected and knowledgeable, they work even better. So Dean Carlin and I have some work on when Bill and Melinda Gates gave us some money that we could try to leverage up. It mattered a lot to people who understood that they're really steeped in the development literature and their insights matter a lot. So when quality is uncertain, we should be thinking hard about using seeds. Now, as I just showed you, when you do something that's conditional, matches are quite effective. I would always think twice before using something that's greater than 1-to-1. Now, you can't go all the way down to 1 to 100, but you might be able to go down to 1-to-2 or 1-to-3. And let's say that's an open empirical question. Now, we've also done a fair amount of work on donor gifts. Another way to use upfront money is to take that upfront money and buy a gift, a mug, what have you. What we find is that's an also very, very effective way to use seed money, in that if it's a cold list person, a small gift gets those cold list people to act like they're warm list people and give like they're warm list people. Now, another feature of this work is you should not only care about what happens in the short run, but you should always be measuring, does that short run gain actually multiply or scale into that donor being more generous in the long run? Or is that donor simply taking a gift from 9 months in the future and bringing it back to now? That's very important to understand the dynamics of what you're doing and what you're inducing. Some types of incentives crowd out reasons for future giving, some crowd in. And the science has shown this, and we're trying to expand it, of course, to other settings. Now, those are the types of scientific insights that people on this call, outside of this call, have generated within the community of philanthropy. Now, you should be sitting there saying, okay, some of those I can see how my organization can use them, but in some cases I don't. Because what you might be thinking is, look, that worked in your research study, but it won't work for my donors because they are different people giving for different causes and for different reasons. Now, when you think about it, that's perfectly fine to make that statement. And it's perfectly fine and legit to make that statement, because when you look at the heterogeneity of giving patterns, there are a lot of differences. And here I want you to think about horizontal scaling. I find a result in one setting. Can I scale it to different people in different situations? So just think about these one-size-fits-all campaigns. We know they're wrong just from the science that we've generated. We know men are more price sensitive than women in these settings with tax breaks. We tend to find that women are giving more due to altruism, social pressure, and social cues. Okay. Now, I'm the chief economist at Lyft. And when I step back and say, what would we do if we found this kind of heterogeneity in our customer base? Well, what we would do is we would use well-informed experiments within our setting. We would combine that with very simple machine learning to figure out what scales and what doesn't scale. And if it doesn't scale to certain groups, we try new ideas based on science to figure out what does that new group want from us in terms of not only the program, but also the manner in which we ask for their support. That happens in Silicon Valley and in firms every day, but it happens much less in our sector. And let's face it, our sector, it's 2 to 3% of GDP just in terms of dollars given. If you would include things like volunteerism and just measure what's the time value that people are giving, now we might be up to 4, 5, 6, 7% of GDP. We're a huge sector, and we not only have a huge footprint, but we have a potential long shadow in what we provide, because we provide goods and services that nobody else can provide. The government cannot provide them. That's why our sector is so important. And that's why it's so important to understand, where can I scale this type of result to? Now, a lot of times we also talk about scaling up and finding new prospects. Now, what I mean here is, in step one, we should be thinking about, what does the potential giving pool look like? Who are the people? What is their capacity? Not only today, but where is this going? And where this is going is important, because as you build your donor pyramid, you're making your base as broad as possible. And that ends up not only helping today, but it helps a lot in the future, because you don't know which of those small donors is going to strike it rich. And when they strike it rich, their capacity goes up 100x or 1000x. And if they've been in a habit of giving to you, the evidence is in favor that they will continue to give to you. That's why it's so important for any institutions of higher education on the line. It's so very important originally to get people into the mode of giving to your organization as soon as possible. Even before they walk out the door to go make their millions of dollars, they should be part of a campaign in terms of giving, because that habit formation matters a lot in the long run. So let's step back and take a little bit of a look at this donor pool. And here I'm going to lean on some work that I've been doing with David Novgorodsky and Magna Mogstad. David might be on the call here, so big hat tip to David. He's doing a ton of this work. What we've learned are some interesting facts around prospect pools. Okay, so what I have here is on the x-axis, this is simply the percentile of the national adjusted gross income distribution. So if you go here to the 50th percentile, these are average wage earners here. Okay, now what I'm mapping that into is the y-axis, which is the proportion of national declared charitable giving in that percentile bin. Okay, so this is trying to give you a sense of what is the distribution of giving from the IRS data. And as you can see, this is 2012 tax year, but this is pretty representative of most tax years recently. And what you find is ... Whoa. Okay, what's happening here? That's the top percentile. And they're giving close to 40% of gifts that are in the IRS data. Okay, declared gifts. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack that dot right there. What I've done is I've gone from the 99th to the 99.9th percentile. Boom, 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 boom. Wow. What's going on here? The 99.9th percentile is giving 25% of the gifts. Now let's unpack that. Now I'm going from the 99.9th percentile, boom, 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 all the way up to the 99.999th. This is like the highest 1,036 wage earners that year in the US. Wow, they're giving 14% of gifts in that year. Charitable giving is more concentrated than income is in the US. And it's growing more and more in that direction. This tells me that, wow, the capacity here is I want to invest a lot early on in that donor base, because if I get the random draw where I get someone really far out here, by the way, this is about $32 million in adjusted gross income for this group. That's what you needed to be in that group. They're giving a lot. In fact, for me, it's a lot more than what I ever imagined in terms of giving of money. Now, we also have dug into gender. And what we're doing here is we're just looking at single tax filers. Now, single tax filers, this is a household where it's either a man filing or a woman filing. All the ones where they're joint, we're throwing those out. I believe there's roughly 50% of the tax form. So it's a fair number, millions, millions, and millions. Now, one first thing that jumps out, and a lot of us know this fact, men on average give a lot more than women. In fact, in these data, men will give about $2,100 on average, and women will give about $850 on average. Okay, that's just an empirical fact. But that average hides a lot of interesting stuff. And here's the interesting stuff that it hides. So again, on the x-axis, I have percentile of AGI distribution. So right here is the average. When I go up, this gray dot represents the share within that income bin of men and women. So what it says is that women are about 50% of people in that percentile bin. But within that percentile bin, they give over 60% of the charity. Okay, so what this shows is in nearly every bucket of income, women are more generous than men. So you wouldn't have guessed that from that previous figure. On average, men give more than women, but if you condition on income, so if you set income equal for men and women, women are much more generous than men. So you can say, well, how in the world does the average change? The secret's down here. Remember, at the very top of the distribution is where a lot of the giving comes from. And men are more represented in that dot. And it flips. Those men are a little bit more generous than those women. So that's what flips that average. It's all a deep, deep right tail result. Okay? So now the summary here is high income earners are becoming increasingly more important. Now, what I haven't shown you is they're unique in that they take advantage of the tax code. They give a lot more of their money as non-cash gifts. So gifts like Google stock that is 10x. They give that because there are huge tax breaks in doing that. Okay, they take advantage a lot more of the tax loopholes than what, say, people further down the income distribution do. That's what makes the charitable giving tax really look regressive. Okay. Now, women are a greater share of giving at nearly every income level, which is super important because as the growth of women in the workplace and women's income, which is about time, right? When that continues, if the trend continues here, what we're going to have is a lot more available dollars for charitable giving. Now, as I mentioned, that pattern only begins to reverse in the deep, deep right tail. Okay, so let's take those insights now and go back to the science. Because remember, in the science, I talked about using upfront money and how to use seed money and matching. You might be thinking, well, you know, John, all of that science you talked about is about the modal giver. You know, the giver who's in the 50th percentile of the AGI distribution. And that's right. What we also want to know about for scaling is, what about the modal dollar? We need a lot more empirical evidence and science around those types. That's not easy because there are fewer of them, and a lot of organizations never give us a chance to talk to those people. But we did have one chance, and this is work that I did with Tova Levine and Steve Levitt, which hopefully will be coming out in a journal very soon. So it's very new research, but it's old in the sense that we did it a few years ago. So the question is, if we do the exact same, let's say, treatments that we typically do for, let's say, not so wealthy donors, and we do those same strategies with ultra wealthy donors, what do we find? That's what we did with Booth Business School. So they gave us access to roughly 6,000 high capacity donors. And now with the voltage effect, we're going back and doing more experiments as we speak. Okay. Roughly 48% of this pool made at least one gift in the 2 years prior. So we have roughly an equal warm and cold list. And in a typical year, our subjects in the experiment are giving about $20 million to Booth. Okay, so we're talking about a reasonable amount of money. Now, what we did is we just worked with Booth. On average, they send about 4 donation letters a year. We took one of those months or one of those quarterly letters, and we did it ourselves. And we run what I call a natural field experiment, which is a field experiment that no one knows that they're part of. So we do it in the everyday realm of trying to raise money. We then followed the literature that I talked about earlier, and we varied signal quality and prices. Prices are matches, the match rate. Here's what we find. In many ways, high capacity donors are similar to modal donors. Warm list people are more likely to give than cold list. Signals of program quality, match dollars and donor gifts, matter. The price of giving, i.e. various match rates, it's not important. Just like we found before, having a match is important, the rate is less important. We find some donor fatigue. Too many contacts can be detrimental. That's a question that we should always ask ourselves. Is it once a month? Is it quarterly? Is it once a year? This is an empirical question. Each donor base might be different. Now, what we find that's very different than the small donors is that these givers respond only on the intensive margin. So what I mean by that is those people who would have given anyway are now giving more. I'm not expanding the donor base with this, but I'm expanding what the donors who would otherwise give, what they actually give, and it ends up being more money. You can say, how much more money? A lot. What we look at is over the time lag, which is roughly looking over a 1 or 2 year window, our interventions generate, it seems like way too high, but you can see the paper and see how we generated the results. The results suggest there's noise around it, of course, because there are a limited number of donors, but what it suggests is $30 million more in incremental donations. Okay, so that's a glimpse, but that's a start. And other scientists on this call and outside are now beginning to work more and more with high capacity donors, because this is where the science needs to go as well. Okay, so what I've talked about here is this first step. Okay, that's adding science to the demand side. Now you can ask, well, what about the supply side? Here's where the research has gone in the last few years and where I see the future of SPI. And it's what I call smart philanthropy. Now here, we should ask ourselves, okay, what works? Is our program actually working? For whom does it work for? Do we have an idea or service that can scale? So when I've gone back to donors, and we've just done these pilots recently where we explore, if I can tell a potential donor that I have a program or an idea that can scale, and when I mean scale is when we grow larger, the benefits grow greater and greater. Or as we grow larger, the incremental cost of providing the service goes down. So this is called economies of scale. If we grow, are there these features of a really good idea that it will scale well? Because then I can go back to the donor base and say, look, we have an idea that has the virtues of being able to scale on both the benefit and the cost side. And if we raise money, we can reap those scaling benefits. And then you open up an entire box of these ROI investors who say, look, I want some science that tells me what is my return on investment. If I give you money, give me scientific insights that show the ROI on my money looks good. I'm getting that more and more, especially amongst the young, uber wealthy people who are saying, look, I can invest in my business or I can invest in philanthropy. And I want to take my business insights when it's all about hurdle rates and figuring out ROI, and I want to bring that to philanthropy. So what I'm talking about here is our initial pilots are showing us people will buy into an idea that's scalable. And then as you increase the ROI, as you grow, that only maps more into itself. So the second part then maps over to the demand side, because what you find is when you can say this has a super high ROI, a lot of donors will buy into that. Okay, so now you might be thinking, okay, John, this makes sense, the supply side. How do I show that I have an idea that is scalable? An idea that is truly one where we can grow and it can have high voltage. That's where the book comes in. Okay, so the book is partly about figuring out, do you have a scalable program? And I'm not going to go through these 5 vital signs for you. You can get those from the book. But the book lays out, if your idea has 5 vital signs, then you have an idea that is truly scalable. And this is literally talking about inference. This is about false positives. This is about understanding your audience. You know, how big of a piece of the pie does your idea have, or could it have? The middle here is very important. The situation that your program has worked in, if we scale it up and we have a new kind of situation, will your program still work in that bigger and broader situation? Is it the chef or is it the ingredients? And of course, that's a riff on restaurants and the massive failure there. The fourth one is about spillovers. Does your idea have good spillovers, or does it have bad unintended consequences? And then here I mentioned already, does your idea have a good cost profile? And that's the supply side of scaling an idea. Okay. So that's really the front half of the book. Now, the back half of the book talks about after launch. A lot of you have launched ideas already. You've launched things that you think might work and might help a lot of people. And you've launched ways in which to generate donations. Now, there are these, what I call 4 little behavioral economic secrets that I've worked in government, I've worked for charitable organizations, I've worked for private companies, private industry. All of them make the same mistakes. And the mistakes I break down into 4 little mistakes, or 4 little behavioral economic secrets. So quickly, what are those? People tend to use incentives that don't scale. So in chapter 6, I talk about these are non-pecuniary incentives, non-financial incentives, and behavioral economic incentives that can scale. And you should use those from the very beginning. Now, a lot of times you hear economists talking about make decisions on the margin. And we teach that. That's a fundamental way to think like an economist. When we teach it, it kind of makes sense to us, but it clearly is not getting through to our students, because I see my own students out there and they're still thinking in averages rather than on the margin. So let me give you an example of what I mean, because we learn with examples. So let's think about a phone-a-thon. And when I started at the University of Chicago, I talked to our alumni office, and we talked about whether they should be doing a phone-a-thon or mailers. And what they told me was, well, John, the phone-a-thon on average is about $5 per contact. And the mailer on average is about $1 per contact. So since the phone-a-thons work a little bit better, they don't work so much better. And that's why we shut down the phone bank, because it's just too costly. That's average thinking. So then I inquired, what does it cost you for each additional contact? That's a marginal question. What is the extra cost for each additional contact? And then they said, well, it's 50 cents. Now, you might be wondering, wait a second, what's the difference? The difference is because here you have a bunch of fixed costs. Cost a lot of money for the hardware, the computers, all the programming, and they're counting that here in their average. But of course, that's already sunk. It's a sunk cost. So marginal thinkers say, well, to phone up one more person, it's about 50 cents. The mailer's still $1. So if you're thinking marginally, that gives you the exact opposite result than if you're thinking in averages. They should be doing phone-a-thons, because the marginal cost is much lower than the marginal cost of mailers, plus they raise more money using a phone-a-thon, not only in the short run, but in the long run, because people feel connected to the organization. Okay, that's marginal thinking. I want you to think about big data sets give you averages, but take thin slices of those data. And if you take thin slices, like at Lyft, we talk about whether we should spend money to advertise on Google or Facebook to acquire new drivers. And if you think in terms of averages, it tells you use Facebook. But if you think in margins, it tells you to use Google. And we can save millions of dollars by then using Google because marginal thinking is the right way. And that's looking at thin slices of the data. Okay. So in this chapter, I talk a little bit about my White House days and my quote, John Nash public policy moment that I was working on hazardous and non-hazardous waste sites. And I also have this example in there about charitable giving. Okay. So the fourth little economic secret is that winners quit. And winners quit. This is kind of like a foreign concept because when I was raised in Wisconsin, people told me only losers quit. Quitting is for losers. And this chapter kind of turns that on its head. I think it's a wrong way to view life. And it's both a psychological argument and an economic, scientific argument. And then finally, I talk about culture and how we should think about scaling and building a good culture in our organizations. Okay. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to announce the winners before I throw it over to Amir to ask me some questions. So the winners, hopefully my faithful assistant has sent me the winners. And if not, I can take a few questions and talk about the winners after those questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to say, Diana, make sure you tweak David to send me the winners so I can announce those after I take a few questions, okay? And then I'll talk a little bit about what that experiment is and what I'm trying to learn from it, okay? So Amir, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Well, thanks, John. Okay.
And go ahead, Amir.
Well, that was terrific. It was great to see some of the philanthropic science and get a taste of your book. And I think you've just left enough open that I'm really eager to actually go dig into the 4 mistakes and the 5 vital signs. Got a bunch of really neat questions, and a bunch of them are about the matching issues. I'll try to combine a few of them. I think some people wanted a little bit of clarification. I think you said it was an empirical issue, but you know, how much below 1-to-1 can you go and still get the matching effect? And then people are wondering, does it matter where the match comes from? What if the match, one of our master students, Ms. Nguyen, asked, you know, does it matter if the match, let's say, comes from your employer? Would that make a difference? And then one of the other questions on match, putting them all together, is it about the match and the incentive that affects the price of giving, if you will, or is it really about creating that urgency? Because people feel the sense that those kind of matches are limited in time. So it's really the urgency. How do you unpack all those different possibilities?
Yeah, look, these are great questions. Let me try to take them all on in one swoop. And if I don't, Amir, make sure you come back and push me because I'm not trying to duck anything. The first point is we've gone down to 1 to 3 in some of our work. And for some causes that's worked. And what I mean by worked is 1 to 3 works as well as 1 to 1. Now, there's a limit to that, right? Because if you would go 1 to 100, people would say this is ridiculous. I'm not going to give $100 to get a match of $1. So clearly that result is not a general one. But what we found in some of our work is that you can go down to 1 to 3, and that will yield the same amount of giving as 1 to 1 as in 3 to 1. Okay, but I urge you to try that. Now, the different reasons for giving, you can ask, what exactly are you inducing or generating when you have upfront money? I think one part of the upfront money is a signal of the quality of your organization or your program. So in that way, you're sort of overcoming what economists call market failure. The market failure here is everyone doesn't have the same information about the charity or about the program. And if somebody in the know can give a lot of money and signal it. So we've done experiments whereby we juxtapose an anonymous donor giving versus, say, Bill and Melinda Gates giving. And what we find, or some other expert giving, what you find is when there's uncertainty around the product or service, that name recognition with the money ends up working better than an anonymous donor works. Okay, so that ends up working because It's overcoming the market failure. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it could be to say, look, John, this is an urgency thing. And people are taking gifts from a month or 2 months in the future and bringing them back. If that's all that's happening, that's important to know, because then we're just doing intertemporal substitution and we're not expanding the whole pie. We're just shifting the pie around, which is fine. That's not typically what happens. Typically what happens, they give more and they don't give less, enough less in the future to undo it. But what you're bringing up is right. That stimulant is important for some because they feel the urgency to give before we lose that match. Now, that brings up a good point, because you can't push this too far. Otherwise, people think you're fraudulent. So if you say 10-to-1 match, we have all this money. As a donor, I'm thinking, look, that's just a farce. It's made up. And now you've lost your credibility. And when you lose your credibility, it's very difficult to get it back. So if you have the money anyway and you won't lose it, people might be thinking, they say this all the time. It's a little boy who cried wolf. They're going to lose the match funds. But in the end, they have the match funds and they've probably already spent most of them. So you have to be very careful about the integrity of your drives, because let's face it, in this business, this is a friends and friends and friends business. And this is one where, especially with the larger donors, there might not be any one moment in time. It's a 6 or 9 month process of letting the donors know, here's what we can offer. And if you're interested, let's talk about how you can support. If you're not, then we can move on to something else. Now, in my time as chair, I'll be talking about an anthropologic study that I was doing as chair, and I tried different routes with high capacity donors. And I had some donors going down one path and others down another path. And you can read about some of that. And that's kind of the experimentation around high capacity givers when it's a process of 6 or 9 months. This is a very anthropological now approach that's very different than let me send out 1 million letters and see what works in the next month. Okay, so let me stop there, Amir, and I hope I answered the questions.
I think you did. I think you gave the combined the urgency and those issues really nicely. Let's move a little bit to one of the questions here is 3 sentences long, but it was upvoted. So let me read it. I'll read it. From David Riley. He says, since your distribution of charitable gift amounts is derived from declared gifts, how much does the standard deduction distort your results? The top 1,000 people give 14% of declared gifts, but how much of total gifts do you think that is? If we knew the donation amounts of everyone who took the standard deduction, that 14% number would get smaller, but I don't have a feel for how much smaller.
No, it's a good point. So in the front end of that paper, we are putting together a section that juxtaposes the giving that you would subscribe from the USA Giving, and which is out of Lilly, and the survey-based generated estimates alongside the IRS. Because you're exactly right. What we're only picking up are those people who file. We're not picking up people who aren't even able to deduct. And so on that regard, that certainly is an overestimate. But I think what you won't find in the survey data is a good representation of what's happening in the right tail. So what I mean by that is, remember those dots going across and then the really high up dot, those are still going to be the same, right? Because they're working off of the same denominator. So my broader point is you need IRS data to understand what's happening deep in the right tail. But the relative rates of giving deep in the right tail won't change if I add in the bottom, because I'm just changing the denominator, right? I'm still going to have that upward, let's say, power law, basically, that's going on in the data. But so we try to take that on, David. And look, David's a pioneer in this area, so thanks a lot for chiming in, David. David and I worked on that University of Central Florida paper, as I mentioned. So tickled that you're on, David. is a pioneer in this area. But you're exactly right. The 14 will come down. How much will it come down? It's difficult to know, but we're trying to sort some of those features out.
Great. Wonderful. Another upvoted one from Jaron Cordero on picking up on a little bit on the matching, but as he says, return on investment from the perspective of potential donor can be thought of as the inverse of the price of giving.
That's right.
Your results on matching suggest that the price of giving doesn't really matter. So how do you think makes sense out of the return on investment mattering, but the matching rate not mattering?
Yeah, let's be clear. The declared match rate in these experiments doesn't matter. The marginal tax rate changes when you look at the IRS data and you identify the price effects from those. Those are like real prices, right? Those matter. Then that goes all the way back to Marty Feldstein's work. When you look at short run and long run elasticities, that's how we're getting the price elasticity from those data. Those matter. It's just that what matters much less is when you change the price yourself. It's in part because maybe not everyone opened the envelope. Maybe people don't believe your match and they don't view it as a price, a pure price. So when you say 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, they don't view the 2-to-1 to be half price. It's not as though you actually get twice as many goods, right? Like when you buy a Snickers and you have 2-to-1, you literally walk out with 2 bars of Snickers. You know what you're getting. But here, maybe the quality changes of the good provided, or maybe you just don't believe that it's truly 2 or 1-to-1. So I'd be very careful. Those are price effects in the true sense, as long as people are interpreting the match in that way. They clearly don't. The price effects from the IRS data you can see. Now going to the ROI, this is now coming from, I have a program and I can show you program evidence scientifically that says every dollar we spend, we can increase cognitive test scores by 15 percentile points. And then I can tell you those 15 percentile points, they serve as a pretty nice surrogate for long run labor market outcomes and whether you're going to drop out of school or not. And then from there, you can dollarize that, right? What I'm saying is, so far, there's been an effect on that ROI, needs to be replicated, needs to be looked at. There's not even an academic paper on this yet, that those donors who are young business people and want to know about ROI, so there's a selection problem, right? They want to know about ROI, and then they're affected by ROI. But that's how I would put all of that together, okay? Now, we're at the end, Amir, I apologize. I want to announce the winners because we do have now people are going to think this is cooked, but the target was 27. And Jeff Livingston, who happens to be one of my old PhD students from the University of Maryland, Jeff, thanks for being on. You were drawn at random and you were the closest. So Jeff Livingston, congratulations. I can only imagine what you're going to want me to sign. And then the winner of the equilibrium was Mark Ulrich. Mark guessed the equilibrium correct, which was number 1. Amir, I'm not sure if you got number 1, but this game was not invented by me. This is an old popular game that John Maynard Keynes is attributed credit for. It's called the beauty contest game. And the idea back then was he put, as the story goes, he put pictures of women in a newspaper, and the contest was guess what everyone else will say is the most popular or most beautiful woman. And that's why it's called the beauty contest game. And he felt that that was important to understand how people pick stocks and how he wanted to pick stocks. So here you think about the equilibrium of once you guess 1, no one has an incentive to change. So if everyone would have guessed 25, what would have happened is we would have drew one of you randomly to win. So you would have had an incentive, Amir, to guess 24. And then you would have won. And that keeps iterating down to number 1. And then since you can only guess 1 to 100 inclusive, 1's the equilibrium.
Great. Well, that's a great way to end the session, John. Thank you so much. This was terrific, and what a good discussion as well. We look forward to reading your book and seeing you in Indianapolis in September. In the meantime, please do join us on the 3rd of March when Chris Clapp will be talking about philanthropy and the environment. So thank you all, and stay safe and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.